Tom Shroder, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
So, Tom, you're the author of the wonderful book, Acid Test. Has a longer title than that.
LSD, Ecstasy, and the Power to Heal.
It is whirlwind of a book. A friend actually told me about it who has no interest in the field, really, and said it was on some, I think it was like a top 50 books of all time list or something. I said, well, that's right up my alley, so I'll go ahead and, pop $20 down. And I loved it so much that I reached out right away before I was even finished to interview you here. I thought it did a really good job giving a general overview of the history and like some really cool stories that weren't necessarily part of many other books. You had a couple gems in there that I hadn't really heard before and was really grateful for. And then it tied into this narrative of a Marine that was able to heal a bunch from MDMA psychotherapy. With the Griffiths or with the Mithoffers?
Mithoffers.
Cool. They're actually good friends with the people Kyle and I studied breath work with. They actually did the training together, I think, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, they were using the MDMA and this was the first clinical trial to try to use it for PTSD, combat-related PTSD.
Yeah, that's interesting. So how did you get kind of involved in this whole world? Like, you must have got interested enough.
Crazy. I mean, it's actually a pretty crazy story because it goes all the way back to when I was like 20 years old. I was a student journalist at the University of Florida, and I was home on spring break, I think, and I either heard or saw a little blurb in the newspaper that there was this like hippie building this sort of magnificent cedar and stone house out in the woods east of Sarasota, Florida, where I was from. And so I decided it might be a good feature for our college publication. So I drove out there, and here's this long-haired guy, shirtless. He's got this wolf tied to a chain in his front yard, and the house is really amazing, really magnificent. So I start talking to him about it, and it becomes clear to me that he says that he's building this house. He didn't say it was a physical manifestation of what he'd learned on acid, but it was clear to me that that's what he was talking about. And I just thought that was really cool. I mean, I was interested in it because I had some powerful experiences with psilocybin mushrooms, which actually grew out in the cow pastures near Gainesville. And they, I couldn't understand the people who looked at doing it kind of as recreation, because it had been so meaningful and I'd learned so much about myself from doing it and learned some really important things that, informed my life from then on. And so, when he started talking about this on a really, this sort of profound level, and that he decided he was going to express it by building this house, that really caught my attention. And so I wrote this story, it ran, and then 10 years go by, and meanwhile I've graduated, I've worked my way up through newspapers, and I became the editor of the Sunday magazine for the Miami Herald. And this was in 1985. And I see this little blurb in the Tampa paper about this sort of perpetual college student acid head who has decided that this new drug called Ecstasy is going to be the future of psychotherapeutic drugs, and that it can cure all sorts of emotional and psychiatric ills, and I'm looking at it and I realize it's the same guy. It's the guy that was building the house. So, and his name was Rick Doblin, and so I sent a reporter over to write a story about it, and we ran it on the cover of the magazine. It was called something like Tim Leary for the 80s. And so that happened. And then another, maybe close to 20 years goes by. And by that point, I was the editor of the Washington Post magazine. And I see this little blurb in the New York Times saying that Harvard is doing the first psychedelic research they've done since they booted Tim Leary out. And it was being sponsored by this nonprofit organization called MAPS. And the head of that nonprofit was Rick Doblin. I said, oh my God, here he is now. Here was this like completely loose cannon running around doing this drug, which was soon going to be illegal, and sort of on a whole underground scene. And now he was like working with Harvard. So what's the deal? So I got a number for him and I called him, and not only did he remembered all those stories that had been written in the past. And he said not only did he remember it, but he said he had just shown his board of directors the cover of the 1985 story from Miami Herald to make the point of how much he sort of transitioned into being a sort of from the underground to the mainstream, which turned out to not be quite as true as he had hoped, because Harvard then canceled they prevented the program, his research from going forward, precisely because when a new president came in of the McLean Psychiatric Hospital, he didn't want anything to do with Rick because he knew he said this because he was still this unreconstructed freak, basically. And he was very outspoken and had, he didn't hide his beliefs that psychedelics were good for you, and that wasn't the kind of attitude they wanted to be associated with. So that shut down, but this guy the psychiatrist named Michael Midhofer, who had been an emergency room doctor in South Carolina, in Charleston, and had decided that the emergency room was a place where he saw the ends of really bad things, of bad lifestyle choices that people were making. And he didn't want to just be dealing with the result of it. He wanted to get out in front of it. And he also, as so many people in the research had very powerful experience with psychedelics when he was a young man. And it always stayed in his mind as something, and he decided that he was really interested in the way that the experience seemed to heal you, unlike psychiatric drugs that were being prescribed, which just sort of tried to impact your body without your participation. That this was something where people were participating in their own cure, and they were participating through the experience that the psychedelics engendered. But everything was illegal at this point, and so he was really interested. There was a Czech scientist who had probably done more psychedelic therapy than anybody in history. A guy named, as you know, his name's Stan Grof. And so he looked them up and he realized that Grof had dealt with the fact that all psychedelics had become illegal by trying to find another method by which you could attain the kind of consciousness that was healing. Because he understood from all his experience that it wasn't the drug itself that healed you, like penicillin heals an infection. It wasn't the drug itself, but it was the experience that the drug allowed you to have.
Right.
And so he looked around the world and discovered that all sorts of cultures try to get you into an altered state of consciousness to deal with cures of various issues. And then one way they did it was through a kind of hyperventilation. And he sort of developed this technique called breath work, where it's sort of guided breathing with loud music, et cetera. And it doesn't seem like it could do anything much, but he had tremendous results, and he felt they were very similar to the results he had with LSD, in fact. So Michael went out and learned all that, and he was actually using it in his practice, and he specialized in traumatic stress disorder. And but then he realized that there were some people that just didn't take to it. It was too much work. It was too distracting, the whole process of the heavy breathing and all that stuff. And he just thought, it seemed immoral to him that he knew that there was something that could help them get beyond that could help people who weren't being helped by the breath work. And he couldn't even suggest it to him because it was a Schedule I drug, up there with heroin and cocaine. And so he started thinking that maybe he wanted to do research on it out of the country, someplace where it was legal. And so he goes to this conference, and who does he run into? Rick Doblin, of course. And meanwhile, Doblin has been fighting this prohibition against psychedelics ever since 1985, basically for at that point 25 years, and it was so stigmatized that he couldn't find a psychiatrist who was willing to work with him. And so when Michael came up to him at the conference and said, I want to study the healing power of psychedelic drugs, so what country can I do that in? Rick said to him, well, are you a psychiatrist? And Michael said, yeah. And he says, well, then you can do it in this country and I'm going to help you. So that's how it all started. And then it took them forever to get through the DEA and the FDA to get them to approve this. And it was, they were like intentionally trying to kill it off to the point where the government funded this researcher who found that MDMA, which is ecstasy, same thing, was incredibly toxic. And so toxic that they were about to get this research started and everybody withdrew their support for it. Then a year later, it turns out that this incredibly toxic drug that he said was MDMA had in fact been mislabeled, and it was methamphetamine.
Interesting.
But there was the really tremendous irony there was that methamphetamine, which was so toxic that when they thought it was MDMA, it shut down everything, already was a prescription drug. You could prescribe that drug.
Right.
And it was never on Schedule I. And so MDMA, which was far less toxic than methamphetamine, eventually, though, they got it straightened out. And then there was this whole dance with the DEA that, they had to have a safe to put it in. Because even though you could go out and buy it on the street, they had the small amount, they had to put it in the safe. They did a background on the doctor that had the office behind the safe, because as Michael said, was like they were afraid he was going to drill through the wall to get to this stash. It was just, and they had to have alarms on it, and it was all incredibly costly. But finally they started doing it. In the first, when I did the magazine story on it, the first one was mostly for women victims of rape and sexual abuse. And these were people who had been, they had tried all sorts of other therapies. I mean, they called them treatment resistant, and nothing worked for them. And this had been going on years. And, it gets to the point, people who have PTSD and can't find relief from it, inevitably are thinking of suicide. It's that bad. And so, I was able to listen to the tapes of these therapy sessions with the patient's approval and interview the patients. And it was just remarkable to see what happened. These things that they couldn't even, these sort of root terrors that they couldn't even approach for years. Once they were taking in the MDMA experience, suddenly they were able to revisit them, re-experience them, remember things that they hadn't even remembered, and to sort of reprocess it and to see it in a whole different way. Like to hear the people have these insights was amazing. Like one woman suddenly said, "Oh my God, my mother traded my childhood so she could have like sex with this guy."
Jeez.
And then these, like she almost had these physical convulsions as all these feelings like poured out of her. And then after that, she was, it wasn't like they were instantly fine, but as one person told me that it was like they'd been on this battlefield for all these years in the middle of a war, and that they felt like this had floated them up above the battlefield so that they could see that even though they were still in the battlefield, there was a path that led out of it. And so the process of assimilating the experience afterwards was the process of finding the path and taking it to get out of there. But they knew that there was a way out, where before they were sure there was no way out. And that's what provokes this sort of suicidal thoughts.
Mm.
So then I did that, and I instantly I thought I would like to do a book on it. But people were saying, I don't know, maybe a magazine story, the publishers. So what I realized was, and I knew that they were planning to do a study on veterans coming back with PTSD. And, the war had started in 2003, and it had been going on for a decade. And, there were all, like, one Pentagon study showed that something like 12 to 20% of people who had been in the theaters of war were coming back with PTSD, which, when you do the numbers, that amounts to as many as like 500,000 veterans coming home with PTSD. And this is a condition that will affect them for decades and costs a tremendous amount of money in both immediate health care and in all the things that happen to people with PTSD, not to mention that often they can't work and they can't contribute to the economy. So it's a huge problem for all of us.
Right. And even I think there's a lot of research now with trauma and like epigenetics. So, even that could be like passed down generationally I was just at a conference and they were talking that
the idea being that kind of horrible stress and trauma will somehow impact genes and will create problems for offspring.
Yeah, I was just at a conference and they were talking about how it could affect up to 5 generations, or it could go back 5 generations. So yeah, you think about all the trauma that's been passed down.
So once I knew that was when I was able to convince the publisher that it was a good idea for a book. And then, of course, as I began the deeper research, I was shocked to discover how far along psychedelic therapy had been before the 60s. And that's almost forgotten. It was amazing the degree to which the reaction to when it got into the popular culture in the 60s and it became the youth drug culture, et cetera, and the hysterical reaction to that, and people freaked out, and people in authority freaked out, and they shut down. Of course, it didn't shut down illegal usage of it because that continued. But what they did shut down was all legitimate research. And there'd been so much of it. At the time before that happened, in the late 50s and early 60s, it had been the most studied psychoactive drug in history. And it was not only being studied, but it was being clinically useful and had treated thousands and thousands of people with with really remarkable results and very remarkably few negative consequences. And they, so I was really amazed because, one researcher told me it was like when the crackdown came, it was almost as if psychedelics had been uninvented. It was that, and the stigma, especially in the medical and academic communities, was so great that there were all these people who sort of had this closeted interest in psychedelics that couldn't even say that to anybody because it would stigmatize their careers. And that's where Rick Doblin came in. He was sort of unafraid to trumpet it and to keep banging his head against the wall, which was what it was like, and decided that the only way to get through it, that politics was hopeless, so they had to just do it through good science, to get science that nobody could deny. And basically it took them 30 years to get to the point where they were able to treat this Marine that we talked about. His name was Nicholas Blackston. And he had tremendous, he was almost suicidal, or was suicidal. And by the time he finished with the therapy, he wouldn't have even been classified as having PTSD by their standard test that they used.
It's amazing.
So that's one of the reasons why a lot of us are so frustrated with the field, is exactly what you're saying about the historical research. Like, we had effectively all the safety data we need, and we had all the real research we needed to prove that it was useful and could be useful in almost any culture. And it was just erased.
Well, and then whenever that was brought up, people said, well, they didn't have the research standards that we have now. So basically, they have to redo all the research. And and I don't know if you've ever heard this comment at a conference, but there was one conference where a presenter gets up there and saying, it's like, we have to pretend that we don't know if this is successful, if this works.
What other field does that?
That's bull, because we know damn well that it works because it worked for 20 years, and we don't need to, so they're going through using all the rigorous standards to do the research, to redo the research that had already been done. And so it had already been used to help people with addictions and alcohol, and all of this stuff had been used before in the 50s and 60s.
Right. There was even, I remember when I was doing research during my undergrad, I came across a study, I forget what country it was in, but it was during like the 50s. They were even giving, I think, like small doses of LSD to kids with, I think, Down syndrome or some sort of mental disability. Autism, maybe that's what it was.
Autism, probably. I doubt Down syndrome. But
autism, probably.
Yeah, and now there's a new study, an ongoing study with autism now with MDMA.
Right.
Because it had been in the sort of autism community, there was anecdotal evidence that sometimes they took MDMA on their own and they really felt like it really helped them. So, so very often that's, it's been used sort of underground and informally, successfully. Sort of like my experience was simply that I was having all these doubts and anxieties, and I ate some mushrooms, and as they began to take effect, the doubts and anxieties only sharpened. I became more and more obsessed with them until finally I kind of had this vision that I was like carrying this boulder, and the boulder was all of my doubts and anxieties, and I realized that I was carrying it. In other words, all I had to do is let it go, and it would drop right away. And it's one thing intellectually to say, well, you're choosing to some degree to feel these things, that it's a choice to feel anxious. But when you actually have that experience, it's so concrete, it's so real that it's much more effective. And ever since then, even though, I can't always do that, but I'm just like the person who saw the path out of the battlefield, I knew that the truth of the matter was that whenever I have negative feelings, that I'm choosing to feel them, and I can choose not to. I can choose just to let it go. So that's been incredibly valuable to me, and that's the kind of insights that I saw people having throughout this research, and that's why all these researchers know that it works. It's not like, do we have to prove it through a double blind that it's not suggestive? Well, it is I mean, it's all. That's the thing about psychedelics is the suggestions become more than suggestions. They become kind of a reality.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why they also can be dangerous. I mean, psychologically dangerous if they're not used in a safe and supportive environment, because, you can get caught up in some negative suggestions as well. And it can be really scary. And if you don't work through them, if you don't have someone there helping you to work through them, you can end up in the emergency room. I mean, that happens.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When you were doing your research, did you get into any of the like weaponized psychedelic stuff?
Oh, well, yes. Yeah, of course. It started when the what was soon to become the CIA during World War II captured Nazi documents about research they'd done with mescaline, where at first they were going to use it as an interrogation drug, figuring that people would be so freaked out and so terrified that they'd tell you whatever you wanted to know. It's almost like an enhanced torture technique or something. But then they concluded that it was worthless because you couldn't really, you didn't have no idea it was just crazy. And so the CIA decided that maybe there was still some value in it. And so they began this decades-long program where at first they were thinking, well, maybe it's a truth serum. And then they thought, well, maybe if we give it to our own agents and they take it before and when they're captured, they'd be incapable of telling the truth. Or maybe we could use it to like drive a entire enemy population crazy by putting it in their water, all sorts of weird stuff. And it was so irresponsible. They owned a brothel in San Francisco, and they would sort of get the Johns in there and put it in their drinks. And so all these people who don't know that they're ingesting LSD, so just to see what happened. And of course, that's a very, since an anxiety reaction is one of the possible negative side effects of doing it, you can imagine if you think that you're going crazy and you don't know what the cause is, it's not because, I decided to take this psychedelic. And it just starts happening to you. You imagine what kind of fear that would take and how the fear is magnified by. So, I think there were probably some suicides as a result of that. However, they were indirectly responsible, and the irony is that they were pumping all this sort of unauthorized LSD and funding research of LSD into the population, and people had positive experiences with it, and that's how it got into the popular culture. So basically, we have Ken Kesey and Owsley, who had initially experienced LSD in CIA-funded research. So if it hadn't been for the CIA, the 60s counterculture psychedelic explosion never would have happened. And then when it did happen, of course, that shut down all the... So the CIA mucking around is like extremely significant in the history of psychedelics, because they both spread it into popular culture and created the backlash that shut down the legitimate use and research.
Interesting. Keezy, I read the electric Kool-Aid acid test. Was he over at like some program in Stanford when they were doing that research, or
Menlo Park?
Menlo Park.
It was at the mental hospital there, and he volunteered for it. And I think it's in electric Kool-Aid acid. It's this great description of him sort of being in this little examination room, and he's like rising above it, transcending the room, and there are all these little people in white coats sort of asking him these stupid questions. He's just going, man, they do not get it at all. And I could just really identify with that, where it's just like, wow, they're just like, they cannot see, what I see.
So what to you, when you were doing all your research, were other than the medical stuff, like Nicholas's story, came up as being like really significant and maybe under discussed in the field?
Well, I think that the usefulness of the psychedelic experience to healthy people is the thing that's difficult to discuss, because it's sort of like, am I advocating that there be free access to psychedelic, anybody? Well, there are a lot of people who would be dangerous too, but a lot of things are dangerous to people. And in fact, Johns Hopkins was interested in exactly that question, and they did this study of a few dozen healthy, high-achieving volunteers who had never done psychedelics before. And they gave them psychedelic. They gave them, I think, psilocybin. And they chose psilocybin because it didn't have the stigma of LSD or ecstasy.
Right.
And yet it had results very similar to LSD, more similar to LSD than to ecstasy. And like 80% or 70, I think 70% of the people said that it was like one of the 5 most significant experiences of their lifetime. And then they did a follow-up story in which they did this like study where they talked to people that they worked with and family members who said that they had noticed positive changes in these people after that experience. So, and that's been replicated in other ways as well. So, I mean, so you're left with this idea as well. I mean, should this be something that is, I think inevitably it's going to be approved for clinical use, but it's taking way too long. But inevitably it's going to be approved because it's already in the study process, and the results are consistently good, and there's no sort of terrible outcomes that are happening. But how do you get from there to the thing where people who are just interested in developing themselves as human beings get to have that experience periodically? Now, there is some legal or semi-legal religious use of ayahuasca and of peyote in the Native American church. But that's very specific, and it's not sort of like widely available. So to me, that's what motivated me to begin with, was that
right.
I thought, hey, this is valuable just for a human being, and so it was interesting to me that was really what was behind the people who were doing the research with psilocybin. They really were moved by that same idea. Mm-hmm. So that was the part that was most interesting to me, really. As essential as it is for all these people who are suffering, I don't want to give that short shrift, but that's easier to focus on in our culture.
Right. And to frame medical problems around it.
Right, exactly. But that's just one aspect of it, and it's really all part of the same thing, the same experience, which is, you could call it sort of like an enlightenment. And that's a real thing. people of having those kind of experience with and without drugs helping them for thousands of years. And a lot of the things that have come out of that have been incorporated into culture in a very positive way.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of people we talk to for this show kind of have concerns of the direction the research is heading, and making it look like you're only ever going to be able to do it in a hotel room or like a hospital or something in a really medical context, kind of eliminating the opportunity to do it legally in a sanctioned way. Like, have you run into anybody that's actually doing the work, public figures, to try to make it accessible to normal folks?
Well, there is that. I think that the hope is that if it becomes, available for therapeutic use, that the plans they have. First of all, in the old days, they did it in like these sterile rooms with guys in white coats. Now the sort of pro forma they're developing, the procedure, is in a comfortable place with very reassuring people, music of your choice, etc. So it's in a positive environment, and I think to some limited degree, the idea is that as this becomes more and more accepted, that they'll be able to expand these. All drugs that are approved, they start using off-label uses for them, and so it could be marriage counseling, or people with eating disorders, or people who ultimately just want to have a deeper experience and get more in touch with themselves. Where you could go and talk to and say, hey, I'm just trying to figure some things out about myself, and they'll write you a prescription for the therapy, and then you'll go and have it, and the and the environment would be maybe in a controlled outdoor space or something like that.
Well, that would be really interesting if almost any therapist or psychiatrist could prescribe that kind of therapy. Say, maybe, all right, we did 5 sessions, maybe you go to this center and then come back.
Yes, right, exactly. And, that's the way it was. That's the way it was in the 50s and early 60s. That was exactly the way it was used. Was psychiatrists even psychologists would have patients, and they'd say, why don't you go have one of these sessions and see where that brings you?
For me, like taking it out of that category of being the world's most dangerous types of drugs, having a medical prescription possibility then lowers the legal threat.
Yes,
and then opens up a whole world of possibility.
And that's exactly what I think they're working towards. What worries me, of course, is that they're getting to the point where they're going to, how all the phases work. The phase 1, which is just establish it, that doesn't kill people. Then phase 2 is kind of shows that you can give it in a clinical setting under medical supervision, and it can seem to help with a problem, and it won't create any new problems. And you do that with maybe a couple hundred people over in a few dozen studies, and then you present all that to the FDA, and they let you go on to phase 3, which is where you have it in a lot of clinical centers, and you do like hundreds of people instead of and then that's when the numbers, then they look at all the numbers and say, okay, this is proof that it's safe and effective, and now we can allow it to be prescribed. However, in the case of psychedelics, because they're Schedule 1, at some point they would have to be taken off of Schedule 1, because one of the things about Schedule 1 is no approved medical use. So if they're going to approve for medical use, so at that point, it concerns me that it would get political again. That all the ugly old stereotypes and unfounded fears about psychedelics would pop up again, and it might be difficult to get it off of Schedule 1. We saw something like that with marijuana, where the government was only allowing one person to grow marijuana for research, and it was really a logjam. And so just recently, they allowed more people to grow it for approved research. However, they refused to take it off of Schedule 1. Even though it's being used in states for medical reasons, they still are claiming there's no recognized medical use for it, which makes no sense, of course. And I'm afraid that something similar will happen with psychedelics, but unfortunately, that probably is at least 5 years away.
I'm sure people are working on preparing for that political battle.
Oh yeah.
On both sides.
On both sides. Yeah. Do you remember? I don't know if you know this, but when the psychiatric psychedelic community was in a unique position in 1985 because they'd been using MDMA, which wasn't yet illegal, in their practice. Because when LSD became illegal, they had to stop using that. But MDMA was this new drug that hadn't been declared illegal, so they were using it. But they also knew that it was only a matter of time before the DEA caught up with them, and we're going to make it Schedule 1. So with Rick Doblin, who was basically this college dropout, somehow insinuated himself into this psychedelic elite group, and he was the driving force behind getting them to fight it legally. They said, okay, we're not going to just let this happen, because there's this review process when the DEA decides to schedule this drug, and we are going to have all this evidence and all these doctors come and testify that it does have legitimate medical use and that it is not particularly addictive or particularly unsafe. And they did that, and they won. The hearing judge ruled in their favor straight down the line, and then the DEA said, well, thanks for your ruling, we're going to ignore that.
Jeez.
And then they appealed, and they won again, and then the DEA did some little shell game with saying, well, we're going to change the wording in our prohibitions, but it's still going to be on Schedule 1. So they won, they won every which way they could have, but the DEA just, because it was an advisory type of thing, it was an administrative hearing, it wasn't a civil, it wasn't a regular court of law, it was an administrative law. So the DEA could just ignore it if they chose to, and that's what they did. And so then it took from 1985 until 2005 before that was 20 years lost to research that could have been, it's really sickening, actually.
Yeah. The simple math you have to run in your head is how much, if there was a unit of measure for suffering, how many suffering units have transpired that could have been removed.
And that still happens every day. It kills me. I get people all the time sending me messages saying, I have this, and describing some really horrible case that they are or know of, and saying, how can I do this? Or how can I find somebody? And I say, well, there are these ayahuasca things, but they have, sometimes you don't know what you're getting on that. A lot of
baggage.
And then there are these underground therapists who are continuing to work, but how do you hook up with that?
Yeah, it's risky too.
Yeah.
Our suggestion whenever people ask that stuff, I always say, maybe seek out somebody that's facilitating breath work.
Yes, that's
just as a nice little dive in the water,
Yes, yeah, I say that too, and and it works for a lot of people, just not for everybody.
Right, because it is a lot of work. It's breath work. Sometimes when I do sessions, I get drained. I'm like, I don't know.
I did it once, and it was 45 minutes, and nothing was happening. And then I stopped, and suddenly I just had that feeling of being totally present. And I thought, I recognize this feeling. It's like, where everything just assumed this sort of much more saturated quality, sort of a extra reality. So, I mean, I guess it could definitely work, but it was, really was time, and it's just not the same.
Right.
The power of the other experience is so all enveloping that it's not like you can't avoid it.
Right.
There's no escape. Yeah. That's true. And it's a valid point. I think when people are really sick and critical with mental health stuff, that the drug intervention is absolutely necessary on stuff like that. I don't think it's arguable that breathwork's a great replacement for those critical situations. But
as to your question about, whether in the future where we're going to get, you've seen all the, really since my book came out, I guess it was 2 years ago, the amount of really accepting and positive press on what's going on has been amazing. The amount of research, and also what the other thing that really helps is the all the studies they're doing with the fMRI, the brain scanning and imaging research that is showing that it really does, sort of kind of suggesting how it works in the brain. Mm-hmm. I think that really helps too, because, it helps people sort of see that this is something that's really changing the way that we think and perceive, and here's why.
Yeah, there's some really interesting studies coming over from Europe with David Nutt and Robin Carhart-Harris and that whole team over there.
The amazing thing is they're basically just sort of demonstrating exactly what Aldous Huxley said in the 50s, which was a remarkable insight, which I'm sure he had while he was on mescaline, which is that the normal consciousness actually reduces the world to manageable, bite-sized sort of abstractions, and that what psychedelics do is they remove that reducing filter and let in sort of reality in all its awesome glory, which might not be, so you might not want to be going about your daily chores when you're tripping, but at least you get a glimpse of reality in a much more full form, which can be enormously helpful, and that's where the insights come from. And so these fMRI studies, the first thing they showed that was really puzzling was, because of the bigness of the psychedelic experience, they were really surprised to see that brain activity was actually reduced when on psychedelics. And then they began to look at where and how it was reduced. And they realized that the structures in the brain that are categorizing and sort of taking the stimuli from the world and sort of putting them in neat little categories, that takes a lot of activity. That's the reducing valve. And when the reducing valve is shut down, then the world just sort of floods in uncategorized. And all parts of the brain start connecting with even though the overall activity is less, the connectivity between different parts of the brain goes way up. And I'm sure you've seen these images where, you have normal consciousness and there's this very sort of rigidly structured thing. And then suddenly you have psychedelic consciousness and the whole sort of, you're looking at the connections just light up like a pinball machine going crazy.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. It's something that you said about actually getting good press or positive press. I was kind of curious, like when you're writing and doing your research, were you kind of worried or concerned about any blowback or maybe negative remarks about this research? Because, I mean, some of it is kind of...
Well, I wasn't really worried about it. I expected to see... I expected when the book came out for people to sort of say, oh, you're encouraging this really dangerous behavior. And I had a cousin who ended up, in the psych ward for the rest of his life because he had, and there was a little bit of that, but in general, there was a far less of that than I realized. And it was met with much more sort of openness and acceptance. than I anticipated. And that's really expanded, and as all this new research is going on. And the thing is that these people who are doing this research, they were impeccable scientists. People who really had excellent credentials and had proven themselves as being really good and careful scientists, and who did really quality work. And there's just a certain, it's hard, when there's enough of that, it becomes difficult to just shout it down.
Right.
Even there are still some people who but that's receding because the facts are against them,
Mm-hmm.
The people who are saying, oh, this is a much more dangerous drug, and they cite outdated, studies that have been proven wrong, like the long-term cognitive consequences of MDMA use. And then it turns out, well, wait a second, you're talking about studies that didn't differentiate, that you were using people who used a whole cocktail of really dangerous drugs, along with, also they did MDMA. So then one of my favorite stories that I came across was they were trying to figure out, well, how do you get around, if you're trying to find somebody who's used MDMA 200 times, how do you find people who've done that, who haven't also done a lot of other drugs?
Other things, yeah.
And then, so they were sort of puzzling this out. And this student writes them, this graduate student from Utah says, well, guess what? Mormons have a prohibition against all these other substances, but it doesn't specifically say ecstasy. So they use ecstasy, but nothing else.
Weird. Huh.
So they finally found this sort of unicorn, which was this community of people who had used MDMA dozens of times or scores of times and had never used any other drugs. I mean, who could have predicted that could possibly? And so what that proved was people who had just used the MDA did not have the cognitive impairment that was shown in some of these other studies.
Mm-hmm.
MDMA does have does impact your brain in ways that persist for some time afterwards, but it doesn't appear to really have a significant negative cognitive impairment. As someone pointed out, says, well, who says that it's, if some other drug did that, they'd call it a feature instead of a danger.
Right.
People are more peaceful or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
So, say a student comes up to you and at a talk or something and asks how to get involved in the field. Do you have any kind of stock advice you give?
Well, I mean, fortunately, MAPS has on its website this great list. They just put it out recently of programs, of academic programs and programs of research. They've sort of compiled it all, so I just send that to them. I mean, there's more and more of that kind of going on. So anybody who's really motivated now can, in fact, find a way to get into a study program. I mean, I'm sure you guys know some more about that.
Yeah, we're trying to develop a nice resource guide for people, maybe extending that list.
Have you seen that one that MAPS put out?
I think David Nichols wrote that a while ago. I wouldn't be surprised if they updated it a bunch since I last read it.
Yeah. But the MAPS website is a wonderful, maps.org is a wonderful resource. I mean, it's just chock full of all sorts of information on the research and on various programs that are going on. I mean, it's a good place to start.
Yeah, it's fun to highlight somebody like you who's an author and a writer and a journalist, because I think sometimes it's more oriented towards psychology and psychiatry and science. So it's just highlighting there's other ways to kind of get into the field. You could, do some writing and whatnot.
Well, there was a course at the University of Alabama on psychedelic history, that I Skyped with them this past spring, I think.
Awesome.
Was the end of it. And that was really interesting.
Cool.
And I would imagine that the academic study of this is, and back in the day, before, when I was doing the research and I talked to people who went through medical school, and psychedelics were never even mentioned.
I have a friend who's a palliative care doctor, so that's like right before hospice care. Tried to have this serious conversation about psychedelic therapies with her, and it was just totally over her head and unwilling to take on any of the real data points, and it's really.
I'm sure that stuff is going to linger for a long time. It's just this kind of receding wave, I think, and. We've seen it happen with marijuana, which seems that it's useful for a lot of things. Although, it's not anywhere near as useful, in my opinion, as psychedelics is.
Absolutely.
The Marine that I featured in Acid Test said that marijuana was the only thing that could kind of calm him down, but he realized that it was really just kind of smoothing out his symptoms. It wasn't really getting to the root of them. Mm-hmm. So then he sort of said, I just don't want to have one more thing that I'm sort of dependent on.
Right.
And so I thought, I think that it might be better for some of the symptoms than the crap that they give people. Mm-hmm. The antipsychotics or the, antidepressants and that kind of thing. And the people that I talked to, that was part of their treatment-resistant qualifications, was that this stuff just made things worse for them. Mm. Oh, and you mentioned Tony. Mm-hmm. He was, the drugs were killing that they were giving him.
Right.
And in fact, he had such a negative reaction to all those drugs that even though he felt the MDMA cured him, he didn't even want to come back for his next session because it was a drug. He had this in his mind, and he felt, hey, I get it now.
Right. Yeah. When he came to class to give a presentation, a student asked him, like, how many times did you take it? He's like, just once. And everybody was like blown away because he was also telling us about his the CAP score, how they rate PTSD, and just how it significantly was decreased over like a number of years. So
yeah, I just think that that's the other thing about this therapy is it's so different from the normal medical model where they put people on a prescription and they're supposed to take it forever because it doesn't cure them. It just sort of maybe helps them with their symptoms, where here they do it a few times and they don't need it anymore. Mm-hmm. It's as I said, it's because it's not the drug so much as the experience.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, it's just a vehicle to kind of get inside and explore a little bit.
So you guys have any, I'm getting near the end here. Do you have any?
I think we're good to wrap. People can find you at tomshroder.com.
Tomshroder.com, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Awesome.
Cool. All right. Thanks,
really
guys.
Appreciate your time.
All right. Take care.
Bye. Thanks so much.